Hey everyone, if your case supports both 120mm fans and 140mm fans, you might be wondering which should you install. You know, do bigger fans actually cool your system better, like some people say, or are they simply quieter? Well, after doing loads of different testing, I can say that the difference does matter, but not actually in the way you'd expect, because for many of my test results, the 120mm fans actually beat the 140mm fans, which I wasn't expecting at all, but after going over all the data again and looking at the smoke match analysis, I think I actually know what's going on, so let's dive into the results. So the way I tested is that I've got a fairly big test bench in my garage with a fairly big case that can support up to 9 140mm fans or 11 120mm fans. I then tested with loads of different fan configs for both 120mm and 140mm fans and also a mix of them both, but I always made sure I used Corsair ML Elite RGB fans just for consistency. And for the thermals, I then stress tested the CPU and the GPU by maxing them out with both OCCT and FirmArc, and I also used smoke matches so we can see the exact airflow between all these tests. Finally, I used a sound decibel meter because some people say that 140mm fans actually generate less sound for the same level of airflow than 120mm fans, so I actually wanted to test that out. So for the very first test, I had 11 total 120mm fans. So this was 2 on the bottom, 4 in the front, set to intake of course, 3 intakes at the top, and then 2 exhausts, 1 at the top and 1 at the back. For the 140mm fans, I then had a total of 9 of these, that's the maximum the case can support, so there were 2 in the bottom, 3 in the front, 2 in the top as intake, and then 2 as exhaust, so 1 at the top and 1 in the back. And we'll look at the temperature data in a minute, but for the actual airflow, it acts in a fairly predictable way. So with the 120mm fan config, the lower front intake fans bring cooler air into the system, and this air is mainly cooling the graphics card. But then, as you can see, the air from the higher up front fans, they still intake of course, and they tend to bring cool air in and that cools the CPU instead. The 3 top intake fans also help to cool the CPU by bringing cool air directly in front of the CPU cooler, and all of this air from all of the intake fans are then exhausted out the back of the case, as you would expect. And obviously here I'm using an air taro cooler, that's just because if I used an all-in-one radiator then I'd lose like 3 or 4 possible fan slots, and I wanted to be able to max out the fan slots for this particular video, but in my next video I will use an all-in-one cooler, and I'll be doing loads of testing with that, so make sure you're subscribed for that. But moving over to the 140mm fan config, you can see that on the surface the airflow patterns are exactly the same as with the 120mm fans. You know, some of the air is helping to cool the graphics card and some is helping to cool the CPU. And then the air is being exhausted out the back and the top of the case, you know, wherever I've got exhaust fans. The bottom intake fans also help to cool the graphics card by bringing air immediately into the path of the CPU, and whilst the PSU is there, in general this air is still a lot cooler than the GPU is pumping out, so in general this does tend to benefit the GPU cooling. You might have spotted one key difference though. With the 120mm fans, they tended to bring air in a fairly focused way, almost like having an immediate cone of air directly in front of the fan, whereas the 140mm fans actually brought air in over a wider area, so the cone is actually a lot wider. And you might be thinking this is obvious because the fan is a lot bigger, so why am I actually talking about that? But this is actually a really key point that I'll come back to later in this video. And for the system noise, for this very first test, I set both fans to be 60%, just so I could see how much noise they created, and both sets of fans resulted in just over 50 decibels of noise, which is equivalent to like a quiet office or street area. So, you know, a bit noisy, but certainly not too distracting. So right now everything seems fairly obvious and predictable. You know, you've got air coming in, cooling the components, and that's working as you would expect. But what I didn't expect was the actual thermal results, because they genuinely surprised me. So for every test I performed, I recorded the ambient temperature, and this then allows us to see the proper delta over ambient results, and between the 2 fan sizes, the 140mm fans actually performed worse, even though both were running at the same speed, and this genuinely surprised me. The CPU was 5 degrees warmer, as was the NVMe drive, and also the graphics card, and this was all over ambient temperatures, and at first I thought I'd just done something completely wrong with my testing, but this pattern is actually something we'll see throughout this video. And I think it actually comes down to 2 main things, which is firstly the number of fans you've got in your system, because we could have 11 of these but 9 when we max everything out, but also how these actually work, because as I've already alluded to, the actual airflow pattern is a bit different, and there is a difference between airflow volume and airflow effectiveness. More on those very important points later, but for the next test I again wanted to test with 11 of the 120mm fans and 9 of the 140mm fans, but I wanted to sound normalize them. In other words, let's say I want my computer to be barely audible. Instead of setting like a fixed fan speed, what I could do is set up the sound meter and say that I only want the system to hit 35 decibels, and then I can bring the actual fan speed down so that I actually hit that 35 decibel level. And interestingly, because the 140mm fans are larger, they didn't need to spin as fast to reach the same noise target. So in my testing, the 140mm fans were running at around 420 RPM, while my 120mm fans had to run faster at over 500 RPM to hit the same noise level. And this then becomes a fairer test than my first one because we're actually comparing, the fans at the same noise level and not at the same fan speed. And to begin with, the airflow would seem to be as we would expect. So some of the air is coming in to cool the graphics card, while some is cooling the CPU cooler, and then it's being exhausted out the back and the top of the case. However, since the fans are running a bit slower, sometimes the air seems to be getting backed up a bit inside the case. It's just drifting around a bit more. And also, when the smoke batch is being held further away from the case, you can see that the majority of the air is not being pulled into the case. I mean, the fans clearly are working, but it's simply a case that the influence of the fans isn't as good because the speed is lower. That's not really a problem though, since we did want a quieter PC, and so the fans are just running fairly slow, but still good to remember. And with the 140mm fans, we see pretty much the same picture. So when the smoke batch is held close to the fans, the air is being drawn in as we would expect, and while some air is lingering around a bit, most of it is ultimately helping to cool the GPU and the CPU. But as before, when the match is held further away, most of the smoke or the air just remains outside of the case. In terms of the thermals, we again have a bit of a surprise. So with both systems normalized to 35 decibels, the slightly slower 140mm fans seem to have an even worse impact on the GPU, with the GPU temps now being 7 degrees worse when adjusting for the ambient temperatures. The CPU temps were also worse with the 140mm fans, as was the system temperature, the VRMOS, the NVMe drives, and basically everything. And I did rerun these tests multiple times and give the system a chance to cool down in between, so this isn't just like sample variation or anything like that. So that covers the situation where we just blindly max out the number of fans in a system, but next I wanted to do some more real-world configs, because in reality most people are going to run with like 2 or 3 intake fans and 1 or 2 exhaust fans. And for these real-world tests, I wanted to target 40 decibels of sound, and after some experimenting, I found that running the 120mm fans at 48% and the 140mm fans at 43% tended to deliver this 40 decibel noise level. So for this first proper test, I went with 3 120mm fans as intake, and then just a single 120mm fan at the back as an exhaust. And when looking at the airflow, you can see that more air is being drawn into the system compared to when we had slower fan speeds. As always, the lower intake fans are more cooling the GPU, and then the top ones are mainly cooling the CPU, and obviously some of the air then is being lost passively out the top of the case, which makes sense because there's just big gaps there and big vents there, and obviously I'd unplugged the top fans there so they were just doing absolutely nothing. And when the smoke batch is being held a bit further away from the case, more of this air is then being sucked back into the case, so overall this airflow looks fairly good. And in terms of the temperatures, this performs better than the test where we just set the fan speeds to 22%, but worse than the 60% fan speed test. But at least we can actually see that even with less fans than, the 20% test where everything was maxed out with those 11 fans, we're actually seeing better thermals. So, it's not actually how many fans you have, it's how effective those fans are, and that's a key point I'll come back to in just a minute. But what happens if we now take that rear exhaust fan, which was 120mm, and swap it with 140mm instead? So as you can see, the 3 intake fans are still 120mm, but the rear is now a Corsair ML140 in a sleek bougie white. Sorry, not sure where that came from. Moving on. And the airflow is pretty much the same here. The 3 intake fans are the same, and the air is also exhausted out the back and the top the same way. There's no real differences there, despite having the 140mm on the back. But in terms of the thermals, victory for once! We finally found a config that doesn't feel like it's just giving random results. So the CPU temp is only 1 degree different, and this is also true of the system temps and the VRMOS, but the GPU is now running 3 degrees cooler. And while that might not sound like much, it kind of makes sense to me that the thing that's generating like 300 watts of energy and heat output and stuff will actually benefit from having more warm air being drawn out the case, because remember the 140mm fan will actually be better at moving that airflow out the case than a 120mm fan will. And since we finally found a config where switching from 120mm to 140mm can create benefit, surely if we actually take the 120mm fan intakes and swap them with 140mm fans, that's also going to benefit us, right? That totally wasn't foreshadowing. So here I've gone for 2 140mm fans as the intake in the front. I could have potentially tried to squeeze a 3rd intake fan in here, but this is a real world test and not many cases allow for 3 140mm fans in the front. So going with 2 fans seemed to be the best decision, and the airflow is what we'd expect at this point. the air comes in, it cools the hardware, and then the air goes out. I'm not sure what else there is to say at this stage, but yeah, you can see it on the screen now, and you can see what the airflow is doing. In terms of the temperature results, this is worse for the CPU than the other two real-world tests that we've shown so far, ending up 1 or 2 degrees above the others. The GPU temps are lower here than when we had 3 120mm fan intakes, which is kind of interesting, and I'll come back to that point later, but for my final real-world test, I wanted to keep the 140mm fans on the intake, but in the exhaust, I then went back to a 120mm fan, because I've had some comments there's better to have more intake air coming into the system than exhaust air coming out, and certainly there's no problem with the system taking air in. As you can see here, both fans are working well, and the air is then being exhausted out the rear and the top of the case, and wherever there's holes and vents in the case, so there's no issues there, that's completely normal. But then when we look at the thermals, it's the worst set of results, at least in terms of the average, because while the CPU temp is only the 3rd worst result out of these 4 real-world tests, the GPU is actually the hottest in this configuration, and it's as much as 4 degrees hotter than when the 120mm and 140mm fans were actually swapped around. And on the surface, this doesn't seem to make much sense, because we still have 140mm fans as the intake, but simply by swapping out that single lonely exhaust fan from, 140mm down to 120mm, we suddenly get worse results. To be honest though, we've seen this pattern throughout, where the GPU actually benefits more from having 140mm fans than we might actually think. And as graphics cards get more and more power hungry, with 5090s drawing 600 watts, exhausting that warm air out of the GPU is going to be a main concern, and that's where 140mm fans shine over 120mm fans, in my opinion. Well, I guess it's not just my opinion, because the data backs that up too, with clear drops on both the real-world tests that had the 140mm exhaust fan. But if 140mm fans are so good, then why do my other tests show that actually for intake fans, 120mm fans can often work out better, especially for general system and motherboard temperatures and also CPU temps? Well, I think there's actually 2 main conclusions here. Firstly, when we tested with every single fan slot maxed out, we actually had 2 more 120mm fans than 140mm fans. Basically, having more airflow sources will always be a good thing, and remember, many cases actually have this space trade-off where if you want to go with 140mm fans, you're going to have less of them than with 120mm fans, so I think this is a real consideration. Secondly, if we look at Corsair's blog, you'll see that they say that 120mm fans are generally better at static pressure, and 140mm fans produce more airflow. And that's because these are smaller and have smaller blades, and as a result they produce more targeted airflow, and we've seen that with the smoke match analysis. And obviously many modern cases like this Meshify 2XL and many others as well, they have various mesh and dust filters, and as a result 120mm fans might actually be better at pulling and pushing that air in and out of the system than 140mm fans. Remember, that's what Corsair was saying and alluding to when they meant the static pressure. And this is actually a really important point. So the 120mm fans tend to have more targeted airflow. And because that airflow is more targeted, it can then cool components like the CPU cooler and the motherboard a bit better than 140mm fans. In other words, when you compare the two, it's not actually the size, it's how you use it. But if you do have an all-in-one cooler, the effect is going to be probably slightly different, and I'll talk about that in my next video in the series, so make sure you're subscribed for that. But at this point you might be wondering, which is the best fan config? This guy has been waffling for ages, can you just tell me what the best fan config is? And the answer is, unfortunately, it can depend, which I know is a bit of an annoying answer, but in general, I think we've proven that 140mm fans can work better as an exhaust, especially when it comes to cooling the GPU. You want to get as much of that warm air out the case as you can, and 140mm fans can work for that. For intake though, I think the coverage actually matters more, and especially we know that 120mm fans produce that targeted airflow, so if you're in a position where you might have 3 or 4 of these, but maybe then only 2 of these, it's probably better to go with 120mm fans, because more is less and all of that. But as always, every case is slightly different and has different airflow patterns, so it's impossible for me to just give a single recommendation that applies to every single case. That wraps up this video, but I'd love to hear from you. I've got the full data on the screen now, so please check that out and leave me a comment with what you think was going on with all of these test results. And if you enjoyed this video, please click the thumbs up button, and please subscribe to see more videos like this. Thanks for watching.